I checked in to the Pineview Motor Lodge on a Tuesday night in late October, and I remember thinking it was the kind of place that existed in the margins of the country, the kind of place you only find if you're already lost or too tired to keep driving. I wasn't lost. I was just tired. 17 years driving long-haul freight will do that to you. It sands down the part of your brain that cares about comfort or aesthetics. You stop needing a nice room. You stop needing anything beyond a flat surface, a working shower, and enough silence to sleep 6 hours before you have to climb back into the cab and do it all over again. I'd stayed in worse places than the Pineview. I'd stayed in places where the ceiling had water stains shaped like continents, and the sheets smelled like someone else's cigarettes, and the lock on the door was just for decoration. So when I pulled the rig off Route 9 and saw the orange vacancy sign buzzing in the wet dark, I didn't think twice. I just pulled in. The parking lot was gravel, and it crunched under my boots like broken teeth when I walked toward the office. There was a covered walkway running the length of the building, the kind held up by painted metal poles that had started to rust at the base, the rust spreading upward like a slow burn. The rooms were numbered in brass digits nailed to each door, and most of the numbers had lost a screw somewhere along the way, so they hung at angles, tilted like they were trying to look away from something. The office light was yellow, not white, the kind of yellowed fluorescent that makes everyone look slightly sick. I pushed open the glass door, and a little bell rang above my head, and the smell hit me immediately. Mildew, and something underneath the mildew, something warmer and more organic, like a vegetable that had been left in standing water too long. The man behind the counter was maybe 60, maybe older. It's hard to say with men who have lived outdoors a lot, men who have been weathered by wind and sun until their skin looks like old leather stretched over something angular. He had white hair cut close to his skull and eyes that were pale, not blue exactly, more the color of old ice, the kind that's been in the freezer so long it's taken on that faint gray tinge. He was reading something when I walked in, and he didn't look up right away. I stood at the counter and waited. The yellow light hummed. Outside, rain had started, a light rain, the kind that doesn't commit, just mists everything with a fine, cold spray. When he did look up, he didn't smile exactly, but his face shifted into something that was meant to communicate welcome without the warmth. He said, "Just the one night." And I said, "Yeah, just the one, heading up to Harrisburg in the morning." He nodded and turned to the keyboard behind him. It was an old-fashioned setup, one of those wooden boards with numbered hooks screwed in rows, and most of the hooks had keys on them. He scanned it for a moment, running his finger along the numbers, and then he reached out and lifted a key from hook number 7. I noticed, even then, that the key for number 13 was hanging on its hook. I noticed it because it was the only key with a red tag instead of a green one. All the others had these little plastic diamond-shaped tags in green, but number 13 had a red one. I remember thinking it was just a management thing, some way of flagging a room for maintenance. Maybe the shower had a leak, or the television was broken. I took the key for 7, signed the paper register he slid across to me, and paid in cash the way I always did. $38. He gave me change from a metal drawer that opened with a sound like a tin can being crushed. I asked him where the vending machine was because I hadn't eaten since noon and my stomach was making its feelings known. He pointed down the walkway to the right and said end of the building, near the laundry. Then he sat back down and picked up whatever he'd been reading. I took that as the end of the conversation. My room was about halfway down the walkway. The rain had picked up a little by then, and it was coming in under the covered walkway at an angle, wetting the concrete in dark patches. I walked with my bag over my shoulder, counting the numbers on the doors out of habit more than anything. 6, 7. I found mine, 8, 9. I stopped when I got to 13. I don't know why I stopped. Some instinct, maybe. Some small animal part of the brain that notices things before the thinking part catches up. The door to room 13 looked like all the other doors. Same dark green paint, slightly peeling at the edges. Same brass number, though the 13 had both its screws and hung level, which I only noticed because everything else was crooked. But there was something else, something small. There was a light on inside. Not a bright light, not the overhead, but something low and warm, like a lamp with a low-watt bulb, and it was bleeding out through the gap at the bottom of the door. A thin line of amber light on the dark concrete of the walkway. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, which doesn't sound like long, but at that hour, in that rain, with that silence, 3 seconds is enough time for your body to register something your mind hasn't named yet. Then I kept walking, found the vending machine, bought a bag of pretzels and a Coke, walked back to room 7 and went to sleep. The next time I thought about room 13 was at 2 in the morning when something woke me up. I lay in bed in the dark and listened. The rain had stopped. The air conditioner in my room was running, doing that cycling thing where it hisses and then shudders and then goes quiet before starting over. But there was something else underneath that sound, something coming from the direction of the wall to my left. I was in room 7. Room 8 would be to my left. Room 13 was 6 doors down, too far for sound to carry, I thought. But as I lay there and let my ears adjust, I started to understand that what I was hearing wasn't coming from next door. It was coming from outside, from the walkway. It was a sound like something being dragged, heavy and slow. A resistance to it, like whatever was being moved didn't want to move. It came in bursts, drag, pause, and then it stopped. And then there was nothing. Just the air conditioner cycling. Just the rain starting back up. Just my own heartbeat, which had gotten louder than I remembered it being. I got up in the morning at 5:30, the way I always did, body clock locked in by years of early dispatch times. Showered, dressed, loaded my bag. Before I went to the office to return the key, I stood outside my door for a minute and looked down the walkway. The gravel of the parking lot was dark with last night's rain, and there were tire tracks in it. wide ones, the kind a delivery truck would make. But I was the only large vehicle in the lot, and my rig was parked at the far end facing the road. The tracks came from somewhere near the building itself, near the end of the walkway near room 13, and they went out toward the exit. I looked at them for a while. Then I went to the office. The old man was already behind the counter. He was standing this time, doing something with a cardboard box, sorting through papers or receipts or something, and when I came in he turned and held out his hand for the key without waiting for me to speak. I put it on the counter instead. I asked him, as casually as I could, whether he'd had some kind of delivery last night. He looked at me. He said no. I asked him about the tracks in the parking lot, and he looked out the window of the office toward the lot and said he didn't see any tracks. I looked too. The gravel was dry. The rain must have stopped earlier than I thought, or the morning wind had scattered things. There was nothing there that I could point to. I asked him about room 13. I don't know why I did it. It came out before I decided to ask it. I said something like, room 13 seemed to have someone in it last night. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking about what to say, but the quiet of someone deciding whether to say anything at all. Then he said, room 13 is not available. I said I could see that. I said I just noticed the light on. I was curious. He looked at me with those pale eyes and said, room 13 is always occupied. And then he turned back to his box of papers. I drove out of that parking lot and got on Route 9, and I thought about those words for about 20 miles. Room 13 is always occupied. It was a weird thing to say. Not, we keep that room reserved. Not, it's under renovation. Always occupied. Like it was a condition of the room itself. Like it was a thing the room did, the way a river is always wet or a fire is always hot. I turned the radio on and found a country station, and I let the music push the thought to the back of my mind. I had a load to deliver. I had a schedule to keep. And I told myself that some small-town motel owner with pale eyes and a strange way of talking was not going to live in my head rent-free. But here's the thing about the road. You cover a lot of the same ground. My route took me through that part of the state once a month, sometimes twice if dispatch needed me to fill a gap. And Route 9 was the most direct path between the distribution hub outside of Trenton and the loading dock in Harrisburg. The Pineview Motor Lodge sat at almost exactly the midpoint, and when the hours got long and the fatigue set in the way it does after a full day of driving, the orange vacancy sign had a pull to it the way a harbor light has a pull for something that's been at sea. I stopped there again in November, and then again in December, and I started to pay attention in a way I hadn't before. The second time I stopped, I got room 9, closer to 13. I asked for it specifically, telling myself it was because it was nearer to the vending machine, which was true, but not the reason. I didn't see anything that night. The light was on again under the door of 13, same low amber, same thin line on the concrete. I stood in front of my own door for a while and looked at it, and then I went inside and slept. And in the morning, the key for 13 was hanging on its hook behind the counter with its red tag. The old man said nothing unusual. The parking lot had no tracks I could point to. The third time was December, mid-month, and the cold had come down hard by then. Ice on the walkway in thin sheets that caught the yellow light from the office and glittered. I got room 9 again, but this time I didn't go straight to my room. I walked the length of the walkway, ostensibly heading for the vending machine, but I slowed when I passed room 12, and then I stopped in front of room 13, and I looked at the door for a long time. No light this time. No amber line on the concrete, just a dark door, just the green paint and the level brass numbers and the silence. I put my hand flat against the wood of the door, and I felt something I didn't expect, which was warmth. Not the warmth of a heater inside, not the radiating warmth you get from a wall shared with another occupied room. This was something more diffuse. The wood of the door was simply warmer than the surrounding air, the way something is warmer when it's been in contact with a living body. I pulled my hand back fast. I went to the vending machine and bought my pretzels and went to my room, and I did not sleep well. In January, I told my wife. My wife's name is Carol, and she has worked as a nurse for 23 years, and she has the particular kind of no-nonsense pragmatism that comes from spending 2 decades dealing with human bodies and everything that goes wrong with them. She listens when I talk, but she also filters, and she's good at identifying when I'm winding myself up over something that has a simple explanation. When I told her about room 13, she listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was unusual for her. And when I finished, she said, "So you think there's something wrong happening in that room?" I said I thought there might be. She said, "Have you seen anything?" I said no. She said, "Have you heard anything you could describe clearly?" I said not clearly. She said, "Then you have a room that's always rented, and a motel owner who's a little odd, and a door that felt warm on a cold night." She said, "Could be a heater issue, could be a water line." She said, "The reason you think it's strange is because he said that strange thing always occupied." She said, "Maybe that's just how he talks." She wasn't wrong, but she also wasn't there. There's something about a place that registers in your body before it registers in your mind, some accumulation of small wrongnesses that adds up to a feeling you can't diagram or explain, only carry. I kept carrying it. It was February when I first saw the car. I'd pulled in on a Thursday, later than usual, almost midnight, because I'd had a long stop in Trenton that ran over. The parking lot was mostly empty, the way it usually was, 1 or 2 sedans near the front rooms, my rig at the far end. But parked directly in front of room 13 was a vehicle I hadn't seen there before. A tan sedan, older model, the kind of car that reads as completely anonymous, the kind you'd see in a parking lot, and 2 minutes later you'd have forgotten the specific shade and make and just remember car. The engine wasn't running. The windows were dark. I stood in the cold for a moment and looked at it. Then I went to the office. The old man was there, of course. He always seemed to be there regardless of the hour, and I had begun to wonder if he lived on the premises, if there was a back room or an apartment attached to the office. I checked in, got my key, and before I could stop myself, I asked him about the car in front of 13. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "That belongs to a guest." I said, "I thought 13 was always occupied." He said, "It is." I said, "Is it the same guest?" And here is where something shifted. He put his hands flat on the counter and leaned forward slightly, and he said, "I think you should get some rest." His voice was level, but there was something underneath the words, not hostility exactly, more like warning. The way you warn a child away from a stove without explaining why fire burns. I took my key and I went to my room. I did not sleep. I lay in room 9 in the dark and stared at the water-stained ceiling and listened. For the first 2 hours I heard nothing unusual. The heater rattled. A car passed on Route 9 and the light swept briefly across my curtains. Somewhere down the walkway, maybe near the office, a door opened and closed. Then, around 2 in the morning, I heard something that made every hair on my arms stand up. It was a voice, coming from the direction of room 13. I couldn't make out words, couldn't even say for certain it was speaking rather than some other human sound, but it was unmistakably a human voice, and it was high, not panicked, not screaming, but high in the way that registers as distress rather than conversation. A sustained note that broke once and then stopped completely. Then silence. I lay in that silence for a long time. I didn't call the office. I didn't go knock on the door. I've thought about that since. I've thought about it a lot. In the morning, the tan sedan was gone. The key for 13 hung on its hook, red tag. I asked the man at the counter, as neutrally as I could manage, whether the guest in 13 had checked out. He said there was no guest checking out this morning. I asked about the car that had been there. He said he didn't know what car I meant. I was standing at the counter looking at his face, and I understood, or thought I understood, that he wasn't confused. He wasn't misremembering. He was choosing what to acknowledge and what to let fall into silence with a precision that looked like practice. Like he'd done it before, many times before. I started making notes. Not dramatic notes, nothing like a journal. I'm not that kind of person. But I started writing down in the margins of my dispatch logbook the date and time, and anything I observed when I stayed at the Pineview. I had a system for it, the way I had a system for everything related to driving. Keep a record, track anomalies, because on the road anomalies matter. An anomaly in a brake system or a fuel line can kill you. I treated the Pineview the same way. Dates, vehicles, key positions, any sounds, any observations. Over the next 3 months, I accumulated 6 entries. March, a pickup truck with out-of-state plates parked in front of 13 for 2 nights. Gone by the 3rd morning without anyone appearing to drive it away. Key on its hook both mornings. April, first visit. No car. Light on under the door. Warmth against the wood when I pressed my hand to it. Faster now. warmer than before. I held my hand there for 10 seconds this time and then pulled away. My palm was sweating. April, second visit. I spoke to one of the other guests. A woman in her maybe 40s, driving a minivan, traveling with what looked like 2 kids based on the travel debris visible through the back window. I ran into her at the vending machine at about 10 in the evening. We talked for a few minutes, the way people do at rest stops and vending machines, a particular kind of conversation that is brief and without expectation. I asked her, as if just making conversation, whether she'd stayed here before. She said no, first time. She said she almost didn't stop because the place gave her a funny feeling. I asked what kind of funny feeling. She looked at me and then looked down the walkway toward the far end, and she said, "It feels like a place that's been holding its breath." I didn't say anything. She took her items from the machine and went back to her room. I stood there for a while in the buzzing light, with the cold pressing in from outside, and I thought about what she said. A place that's been holding its breath. That was exactly right. That was the thing I hadn't been able to name. May, I brought my phone. I set it to record video, propped it on the windowsill of my room aimed at the gap under the door, with a line of sight down the walkway toward room 13. I went to sleep with it running. When I checked it in the morning, I had 6 hours of footage of the empty concrete walkway, except for one section. Between 3:12 and 3:19 in the morning, the footage went dark. Not interrupted, not corrupted, not erased. The timestamp continued running. The counter kept incrementing, but the image was completely black for exactly 7 minutes. Then the walkway reappeared, same as before, same angle, same light. 7 minutes of nothing. I watched it 11 times. My hands were shaking by the 4th time. I need to tell you about the man in the office, because I've been circling around him this whole time, and I need to give you a real picture of him. His name was Darnell. I found that out in April when I noticed the small placard on the counter that said Darnell Prout, proprietor. He never introduced himself, never offered his name in all the months I'd been stopping there, so I filed it away when I saw it and started using it in my notes. Darnell Prout. The more I thought about him over those months, the more I understood that he wasn't simply odd. He had a specific quality that I started to think of as managed distance. He was helpful enough. He processed the transaction. He answered questions. But there was a ceiling on his engagement, a hard stop past which he would not go, and that stop was perfectly calibrated to feel almost but not quite rude, almost but not quite suspicious. It was the performance of a man who had learned exactly how much normal to display. Not more, not less, just enough normal to grease the interaction and end it. I started thinking about how long he'd been there. The Pineview looked like it was built sometime in the early 60s, the architectural style of that era, the low, flat-roofed construction, the particular configuration of the covered walkway and the courtyard-style parking. I couldn't find much online, which itself was odd, because even the most unremarkable businesses usually have some trace on the internet, a review or two, a mention in a local business directory. What I found for the Pineview was almost nothing. A few mentions on older travel sites, nothing more recent than about 15 years old. No reviews, no photographs. One brief mention in a digital archive of a local county newspaper from 1987, a small story about a fire at a nearby property, and the Pineview was listed as adjacent, no other context. I found no mention of Darnell Prout by name anywhere. No social media, no business registrations I could access publicly, nothing. For a man running a business on a state route, it was an extraordinary level of absence. In June, I started talking to truckers. My network on the road is wide after 17 years. You build it slowly through shared parking lots and dispatch frequencies, and the particular camaraderie of people who spend most of their lives in a cab. I started mentioning the Pineview casually, the way you mention a place you've stopped, and watching for recognition. Most people had nothing, never heard of it, wouldn't have reason to off a secondary route, but two men knew it. The first was a guy named Pete, who ran a produce route through that part of Jersey. He said he'd stopped there once, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and he'd never stopped again. I asked why. He said he didn't have a good reason, he just hadn't. He said the place made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't explain. He said he remembered the guy at the counter looking at him like he was being measured for something. I asked him if he'd noticed room 13. He thought about it. He said he remembered the numbers on the doors. He said he remembered thinking one of them was wrong. I asked what he meant by wrong. He said he didn't know, just wrong. He didn't push on it, and neither did I. The second man was different. His name was Tommy Garrett, and he ran refrigerated freight, and he was about 10 years older than me. One of those guys who'd been at it so long he'd started to look like his truck, broad and weathered, and slightly louder than the situation called for. I mentioned the Pineview, and his face did something I wasn't expecting. It closed. Not in a hostile way, but in the way a face closes when a subject is connected to something that still has teeth. He said the one on Route 9. I said yeah. He said with the room. I said yeah. He was quiet for about 30 seconds. Then he said my buddy Marcus stayed there. That was maybe 12 years back. He said Marcus told him about the room before he went back a second time. Tommy said Marcus went back a second time, and Tommy never heard from him again. I asked if he meant Marcus stopped calling or something happened. Tommy said Marcus had a wife and 2 kids and a regular route, and a standing poker night every other Friday, and 1 week he simply did not come home. No accident reported. Truck found in a rest stop 3 states away with his logbook and his phone and his wallet inside. No Marcus. I asked Tommy if he thought the motel had something to do with it. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, I think you should find a different place to sleep. Then he walked away. I drove the rest of that day with Tommy's words sitting on the passenger seat like a physical object. My buddy Marcus. Truck found 3 states away. Wallet and phone inside. No Marcus. There was something in the specificity of it that wouldn't let me dismiss it. A fabrication or an exaggeration tends to be either too vague or too dramatic. Tommy's account was neither. It had the texture of something remembered accurately because the memory came with pain attached. My buddy Marcus. He hadn't said my buddy Marcus disappeared. He'd said he never heard from him again, which is a different thing. That's the language of someone who has made peace with an absence but hasn't explained it. July was a hot month, and the Pineview's parking lot shimmered in the heat when I pulled in. I had made a decision somewhere on the drive up from Trenton, not a conscious decision exactly, more like an understanding that had been building for months and had finally reached some kind of pressure point. I was going to stay in room 13. I was going to ask for it specifically. I parked the rig, and I walked to the office, and Darnell Prout was behind the counter. He looked up, and his face did its practiced shift toward welcome. Before he could reach for a key, I said, "I'd like room 13 tonight." The shift stopped. His face held very still. He said, "Room 13 is not available." I said I could see the key hanging right there. He looked at the board behind him at the red-tagged key, and then he looked back at me. He said, "That room is reserved." I said, "Reserved for who?" He said, "For the occupant." I said, "What occupant? The room is empty." He said, "The room is never empty." I held his gaze for what felt like a long time. Then he reached for the key to room 9, and I took it. I didn't sleep in room 9 that night. I lay on the bed for 2 hours listening to the heat and the insects and the far-off traffic on the highway until everything outside my window settled into stillness. Then I got up. I put my boots on. I went to the door and listened for a long time before I eased it open. The walkway was empty. The parking lot was empty except for my truck and one other vehicle near the front. The light in the office was off for the first time I could ever remember. The whole property had a different quality in this specific middle of the night. Not quieter exactly, but heavier, like the air had more weight to it than it should. I walked to room 13. I want to be accurate about what I felt in those seconds because it matters. I was not frightened the way I expected to be, not in the spike of adrenaline way. What I felt was more like the feeling you get standing at the edge of something high, not the fear of falling, but the awareness of falling as a possibility, a proximity to something that has no edges you can grab. I stood in front of the door and looked down, and there was no light this time. The concrete was dry and dark. I listened. Nothing. I put my hand against the wood, and the warmth was there, the same as before, that body temperature warmth that made no mechanical sense. I held my hand there, and I counted slowly to 30, and the warmth didn't fade the way a heater or a pipe would produce uneven heat. It was steady, like skin. I tried the handle. It turned. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it open 6 inches and held it there. The smell came first. Not decay, not rot, nothing that simple. It was a smell I don't have a perfect word for. Something between copper and wet soil, and something else that might have been the particular smell of a room where a lot of people have breathed for a long time. A staleness that has depth to it, layers, like you could press your hand into it and feel it push back. Then the dark, complete dark, no light source I could see, nothing. And then, from somewhere in that dark, maybe across the room, maybe near the far wall, a sound. Breathing. Slow, measured. Not one person's breathing, more than one. I stood in the doorway with 6 inches of open door, and I listened to the breathing in the dark. And I thought about Marcus, who never came home, and the tan sedan that disappeared, and the woman who said the place felt like it was holding its breath. And I pulled the door shut. I didn't run. I made myself not run. I walked back to my room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone older than me. And I went inside. And I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. And I sat there until the sky outside started to go grey. I checked out at 5:30 as always. Darnell Prout was behind the counter. His face did nothing when I put the key down. I looked at him, and I understood something in that moment. Something that had been assembling itself from pieces over months. He wasn't the source of what lived in room 13. He was the accommodation. He was the person who had organized his entire life, his routines, his careful management of information and interaction around the fact of what was in that room. He'd made peace with it the way you make peace with something that cannot be changed, not comfortably, not happily, but practically. He kept the key on the board. He answered questions about it in the narrowest possible terms. He kept guests away from it when he could, and when he couldn't, he lived with what came after. I wanted to ask him how long. I wanted to ask him what it was. I wanted to ask him about Marcus, and about the tan sedan, and about the 7 minutes of black footage on my phone. I didn't ask him anything. I picked up my copy of the receipt, and I walked out to my truck. I took a different route to Harrisburg that morning, added 40 minutes to the drive. I told dispatch there was construction, which there might have been. I haven't been back to the Pineview since July. I found another place on Route 12 that's clean and cheap, and run by a family who leave the light on in the office, and always have the same channel playing on the television behind the counter. A cooking show. Always a cooking show regardless of the hour, which seems to me like the most normal thing in the world, and I am grateful for it every single time. But here's what I carry. Here's the thing that doesn't let go. I listened to that breathing in the dark of room 13, and it was slow, and it was regular, and it was calm. That's the part I can't make fit into any explanation I can build. If it was people in distress or danger or trapped in some situation I could name, the breathing would have been ragged, panicked, the breathing of people who needed out. It wasn't. It was the breathing of people who were at rest, who had been at rest for a long time. The breathing of people who had stopped trying. And that is worse to me than any scenario involving violence or horror that I can imagine, because at least those have edges. At least those resolve into something you can point to and name. What I heard in that room was the sound of an ending that had already happened, that was still happening, that had been happening so long that the urgency had bled out of it completely, leaving only the rhythm. Slow and steady and patient and dark. The key was on its hook when I left. Red tag, as it always was, as it always would be. I think about the people who didn't get that choice. The ones who checked in and handed over their $38 and got the key with the red tag when Darnell Prute's hand slipped, when he was tired or distracted, or when something in the room's own logic pushed past his management of it. I think about what it felt like to open that door and walk in. I think about whether the door was warm for them too, and whether the breathing started before or after the door closed behind them. I think about the slow settling of it. The way the breathing I heard was the breathing of people who had moved past fear into something else, something quieter. And I think, sometimes at 2 in the morning when the road is dark and the radio isn't enough, I think about how close I came. 6 inches of open door, 2 feet of dark hallway. The breathing. And I think about how the breathing didn't change when I opened the door, didn't quicken, didn't react. Which means it was used to the door opening. Which means this had happened before. Which means I wasn't the first person to stand in that doorway and look into that dark and make the choice I made. I was just one of the ones who turned away. And somewhere on Route 9 in a motel with a buzzing vacancy sign and a wooden keyboard and a man behind the counter who has learned exactly how much normal to show. Room 13 is occupied. It is always occupied. And the key is hanging on the hook with its red tag, and the door is warm to the touch, and the breathing goes on in the dark, patient and slow, waiting for the next person who gets curious, the next person who asks too many questions, the next person who reaches for a door handle at 2 in the morning and feels it turn. Don't stop at the Pine View. Don't let the orange sign pull you in off Route 9, no matter how tired you are. Don't ask about the key with the red tag. And if you ever find yourself standing on that concrete walkway in front of a door that has both its screws when everything else is crooked, and you feel the warmth coming through the wood, and the handle turns in your hand, and the dark opens up in front of you, and you hear the breathing, slow and patient and calm in the dark, you do what I did. You pull the door shut. You walk back to your room. You sit on the edge of the bed until the sky goes grey. And then you drive away. You drive away and you don't look back, and you find a different road, and you never, under any circumstances, go back. Because the breathing doesn't stop. It never stops. And one night, if you push your luck far enough, you'll open that door and step inside, and the breathing will make room for yours, and your key will go on the hook in the morning, and Darnell Prute will look at the next tired driver who walks through his office door, and his face will do its practiced shift toward welcome, and the room will wait, the way it has always waited, the way it will keep waiting, patient in the dark, warm against the cold, full of the sound of Piot. Ella who stopped trying to leave. I told myself I was done with the Pine View. I told Carol I was done with it. I rerouted through Route 12 for 3 solid months, and I kept my head down, and I did my job, and I slept in clean rooms with cooking shows playing behind the counter, and I let the whole thing start to scar over the way things do when you put enough miles between yourself and them. August passed. September passed. I started to breathe easier. I started to sleep through the night again, without waking at 2 in the morning, listening for sounds that weren't there. I started to think that maybe I had built the whole thing into something larger than it was, that the breathing I heard could have been the ventilation system, that the warmth on the door could have been a heating pipe running through the wall, that Darnell Prout was just an odd man running a failing motel on a secondary route, and his strange way of talking was just the particular damage that isolation does to people over time. I almost had myself convinced. Almost. It was October again when I went back. A full year from the first time I'd pulled into that gravel lot. I want to be clear that I didn't plan to go back. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me. Because the alternative is that something in me was drawn back deliberately, and I'm not ready to sit with that idea for too long. What happened was that there was an accident on Route 12, a jackknifed flatbed that had taken out a guardrail and shut down 2 lanes, and dispatch needed me to reroute, and the most efficient reroute ran me back through that part of the state on Route 9, and by the time I passed the Pineview, it was 11:30 at night, and I had been driving for 14 hours. The orange sign was buzzing. Vacancy. I sat at the entrance to the lot, with my turn signal on for what felt like a long time. Then I pulled in. The gravel crunched. The covered walkway was there with its rusting poles and its angled numbers. The office light was yellow, everything exactly as I had left it. Some places change when you're away from them long enough that when you come back, the change tells you time has passed, tells you the world keeps moving even when you're not watching. The Pineview was not that kind of place. The Pineview looked like a place that had opted out of time the way some people opt out of a conversation, completely, without apology, without any indication that it registered the choice as unusual. The parking lot had 1 car in it besides my rig, a blue hatchback near the front rooms. Nothing in front of 13. Darnell Prout looked up when I walked in, and his face did the thing it always did. No recognition. Or if there was recognition, he kept it behind the practiced welcome. He said, "Just the one night." I said, "Yeah." He turned to the keyboard. I watched his hand. It went to the hook for room 9 without hesitation. Same room, same routine. I took the key. I signed the register. I put $38 on the counter, same as always. The price had never changed in all the months I'd been stopping here, which was its own kind of strangeness, inflation being what it was. He counted out my change, and I picked it up, and I was about to turn and go when I stopped myself. I put my hands flat on the counter. I said, "Darnell." He looked up. He was very still. I said, "I need you to tell me what's in that room." He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something move across his face. Not surprise, not anger, something older than either of those things. He said, "You were here before." It wasn't a question. I said, "Yes." He said, "And you went to the door." Again, not a question. I said, "Yes." He was quiet for long enough that I started to think he'd simply decided not to speak again. Then he said, "You should have kept driving tonight." I said, "Maybe," but I didn't. He looked at his hands on the counter, and then he looked back at me and he said, "Come back after midnight if you want to understand." Then he sat down and picked up whatever he was reading, and that was the end of the conversation. I went to room 9. I sat on the edge of the bed with my boots still on, and I looked at the wall and I thought about what he'd said. Come back after midnight if you want to understand. It was the first time in all the months I'd been stopping at the Pine View that he had offered anything. The first crack in the managed distance. Part of me said it was a bad idea, a very obvious bad idea, the kind of thing that in any story told after the fact becomes the moment where the person listening says, and that's where you should have left. Part of me knew that. But there's another part, the part that has driven 2 million miles alone on dark roads, the part that has seen cattle trucks overturned on icy highways and helped drag people out of wreckage before the ambulance arrived. The part of me that has had to make decisions quickly with incomplete information and bad options on both sides. That part said he offered. He's never offered before. This is different. I set my alarm for 12:15, and I lay down with my boots on, and I stared at the ceiling, and I listened to the property settle around me. At 11:45, I heard the office light click off. I heard a door close somewhere toward the back of the building, a heavier door than the room doors, the sound of a door with a serious latch. Then the kind of quiet that is actually full of small sounds when you pay attention. The hum of the ice machine somewhere down the walkway, the ticking of the heater as the temperature dropped outside, the irregular rhythm of insects that shouldn't still be alive this late in October, but were. When my alarm buzzed, I was already awake. The walkway was empty. The office was dark, the yellow light off for only the second time I'd ever seen it. The parking lot glittered faintly with frost. My breath made white shapes in the cold. I walked slowly, my boots quiet on the concrete, and I passed room 10, room 11, room 12, and I stopped in front of 13. There was light under the door, the amber line on the concrete. I put my hand on the wood, and the warmth was there, immediate, the same living warmth that I had felt before, that steady body temperature warmth that should not have been possible from the physics of the room. I stood there with my palm on the door and I waited. Darnell had said come back after midnight. He hadn't said where. I was here. This was the only place that made sense. After about 2 minutes, I heard the sound of footsteps. Not from inside the room, from behind me. I turned, and Darnell Prout was walking toward me down the walkway in a heavy canvas coat, his breath making the same white shapes mine was making, his pale eyes picking up what little ambient light there was, and catching it the way certain eyes do in the dark. He stopped a few feet from me and looked at the door, and then he looked at me. He said, I've been running this place for 31 years. He said it the way you say something you've wanted to say for a long time, evenly, without drama, but with the weight of all the years it's been held in. I said, and before you. He said, my father. Before him, his mother. I said, how long has the room been like this? He said, as long as anyone can remember. I said, what's in there? He looked at the door again. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, people. Just that, people. I said, people who checked in. He said, yes. I said, are they alive? And he turned and looked at me with those pale, ice-colored eyes, and he said, "That's the question everyone asks, and nobody has an answer for that makes sense." He said, "They breathe." I said, "But they don't leave." He said, "They don't leave, and they don't die, and they don't respond to anything from outside. And they've been there since before I was born, and some of them since before my grandmother was born." I felt the cold differently then. Not the temperature cold, but a different kind. The cold of a thought that your body responds to before your mind has processed it. I said, "How many?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "You don't know?" He said, "I've never gone in to count." I said, "Have you gone in at all?" He looked at the walkway between his feet and then back at me, and he said, "Once, when I was 19. My father told me not to." I said, "And?" He said, "I went in and I stood in the dark and I listened to the breathing and I felt something I don't have a word for, and I walked back out and I closed the door and I have not opened it since." I said, "What did you feel?" He said, "Like the room was deciding something about me, like I was being weighed." He said, "I don't know why I walked out. I don't know why I didn't stay." He looked at me. He said, "I think you know what I mean." And I did. I knew exactly what he meant, because I had felt it too. Standing in that doorway in July, with 6 inches of open door, and the breathing in the dark, and the sense of something patient and evaluating in the darkness. Something that was not hostile, but was not benign either. Something that was simply waiting with the confidence of something that does not need to hurry. I asked him about the guests, the ones who came in and got the key and went to the room and didn't come out. He said it didn't happen often. He said he was careful. He said most nights when someone came in, he gave them a different room, and the room stayed quiet and nobody was any the wiser. I said, "But sometimes." He said, "Sometimes." He said there were nights when he was tired or distracted, or when the books weren't balancing, and his mind was elsewhere, and his hand would go to the red-tagged key instead of the others without him quite making the decision. He said, "I know that sounds like an excuse." He said, "It isn't an excuse." He said it in a way that made me believe him, or at least believe that he believed it, that the lapse in those moments was not a choice he was making consciously, but something else, something that operated at a level below conscious decision-making. He said the room has a pull. He said on the bad nights the pull is stronger. I said, "Do you know who they are? The people inside." He said some of them. He had a ledger, a separate ledger, not the guest register. He kept it in the back of the office in a metal box. He said, "There are names going back to 1962. Before that, no ledger, but his grandmother told his father and his father told him that it went back further than the motel itself, that whatever was in the room was there before they built the building, that his grandmother had built the room around it, the way you build a room around something structural you can't move, like a load-bearing wall or a foundation stone." I asked him what his grandmother thought it was. He said she was a practical woman who grew up in a farming family, and she didn't think in terms of what something was. She thought in terms of what something did. He said, "What it does is take people in and keep them." He said she had theories. He said she thought it was a place where something in the fabric of things had worn thin, The way a cloth wears thin in the middle where it's been handled most, and that through the thinness something could reach. Not maliciously, not intentionally. The way a drain isn't malicious. It's just that everything flows toward it because the structure of things makes that the direction of least resistance. I said, that doesn't make me feel better. He said, it wasn't meant to. He said it without humor and without apology, and somehow that was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in a long time. We stood there in the cold for a while. The frost on the parking lot had deepened, and the sky above was very clear, the kind of rural dark that doesn't happen near cities, where you can see the actual depth of space above you, and the stars look like something you could reach if you could get high enough. I said, the guests who check in, do they know what's happening to them? He said he thought so. He said there was a period, maybe the first few minutes, when the door was still open. He said he believed, based on things his father told him, and based on the one time he himself had gone in, that in those first minutes you were still yourself, still present, still capable of choosing to walk back out. He said that was what had happened to him at 19. He had gone in and stood in the dark, and the breathing was all around him, and the pull was there. The same pull he always felt from the door, but much stronger from the inside, like standing at the edge of that high place I described to you, and feeling the gravity of the fall. And he had stood there, and felt himself beginning to let go of something. He didn't know what exactly. He said it felt like the effort you make to maintain your own outline, to stay the shape of yourself. And he had felt himself starting to release that effort, and then something in him had snapped back, and he had walked out. He said he didn't know why he snapped back. He said he had spent 30 years wondering why. He said his father hadn't snapped back. He said his father had gone in one evening in 1989 and not come out. He said he had listened at the door for a long time after, and eventually he could pick his father's breathing out from the others, a particular rhythm he had known his whole life. And it was slow and calm and regular, and it was still there the last time he had listened, which was the same night his father went in because he had not listened since. He said he was not going to tell me what it had cost him to keep running the place after that, because we were strangers, and there wasn't enough night left for that conversation. I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't know what I should have said. I said, why do you keep it open? He said, because if he closed it and walked away, the door would still be there, and the pull would still be there, and without someone managing who got near it, it would be worse. He said, I am the reason it isn't worse. He said it without pride, factually, the way you state a thing that is simply and unfortunately true. He said, you close a place and someone breaks in, and you have teenagers in there on a dare. You have investigators. You have the county wanting to know why a building is sitting abandoned on a commercial route. And eventually, someone goes through that door who doesn't know what they're walking into, and there's no one there to pull the right key, or give them the right room, or do any of the small things I do every night to keep the damage contained. He said, I am the lid on the jar. He said it quietly, and I heard the exhaustion in it. Not the exhaustion of one long night, but the exhaustion of 31 years of the same night, repeating with the weight of all the names in the ledger sitting on him like a physical mass. I asked him if I could see the ledger. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once and turned and walked back toward the office. The back of the office was a small room I'd never seen. A room behind the counter with a door that had been open maybe 2 inches during all my previous visits. Just enough that I'd registered it as a doorway without registering what was beyond it. It was a room that served as a combination living space and workspace. A narrow bed against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, a hot plate, a shelf of canned goods, a bookshelf with a mix of paperbacks, and what looked like old ledgers. Everything clean but compressed, the living space of a person who had reduced their needs to the minimum a long time ago and organized what remained with the precision of someone who didn't want to spend mental energy on the physical details of their life. The metal box was on the bottom shelf. He lifted it out and put it on the table and opened it with a small key from a ring he kept in his coat pocket. The ledger was inside. It was an ordinary composition notebook, or it had been once, but it had been wrapped in contact paper at some point in the past, and the contact paper had yellowed, and the whole thing had the feel of something that had been handled regularly for many years, the cover worn soft, the spine slightly cracked but holding. He put it on the table in front of me and I opened it. The first entry was dated March 14, 1962. A name, Dale Richter. Under the name, a description. Male, approximately 40, driving a red Ford pickup, New York plates. Then a single line of additional information that made my stomach turn. Went in at 11 p.m. Key returned to board at 6 a.m. The handwriting was not Darnell's. It was a woman's handwriting, careful and upright. His grandmother. I turned the pages slowly. There were entries every few months in the early years. Some years had 2 or 3. Some years had none. The handwriting changed partway through. A rougher hand, angular, his father presumably. Then further along it changed again to the cramped, precise script I had seen Darnell use in the guest register. His entries started in 1993, 4 years after his father went in. There was a gap between the last of his father's entries and the first of his. A gap of 4 years with no entries at all. And I understood that gap as a period of someone trying to decide whether to accept what they had inherited or walk away from it, and deciding, finally, to stay. I counted the entries. I counted them twice because the first count seemed wrong. There were 67 names, 67 people over 62 years. 67 keys returned to the board at 6 a.m. 67 people breathing in the dark of room 13, if Darnell's accounting of the situation was accurate, and I had no reason to believe it wasn't. I looked up at him. He was standing by the door with his arms crossed, watching me. I said 67. He said yes. I said, and your father? He said 68. He said it without expression. I looked back at the ledger and I turned to the last entry. It was dated 14 months ago. The name was a woman's name, Sandra Collier. Female, approximately 55, driving a white Nissan, Pennsylvania plates. Went in at 2 a.m. Key returned to board at 6 a.m. Underneath that line, Darnell had written something he hadn't written in any other entry. I looked at it for a long time. He had written, "I was asleep. The first time in 30 years." I closed the ledger. I put it back in the box. He locked it and put it back on the shelf, and we sat down at the small table, and he made coffee on the hot plate, and we sat across from each other in the compressed light of that back room. And he told me things that I am going to tell you now, because they are the part of this that I haven't been able to put down, no matter how many miles I put between myself and Route 9. He told me that the room changed depending on when you went in. Not physically. The physical dimensions stayed the same. He believed, though he was working from limited data on that. One visit at 19 and his father's descriptions from before 1989. But the quality of the dark changed. He said his grandmother had described it as a warm dark, a dark that had texture, a dark that felt inhabited in a way that was not unpleasant, not initially. She had gone in once, deliberately in the early years, before she fully understood what the room was, and she had stood in it for what she thought was a few minutes, and come out to find that 2 hours had passed and her hands were trembling, and she had no memory of the 2 hours beyond the sense that they had been very full, that a great deal had happened in them, though she could not say what. She had tried to write it down immediately after and found that the words wouldn't come, not because she didn't have language for it, but because the memories were dissolving faster than she could get them onto the page, the way a dream dissolves in the first minutes of waking. What she retained was a feeling. She described it to his father, who described it to Darnell as the feeling of being completely known, not judged, not evaluated in a hostile way, simply known. Every part of you, the parts you show and the parts you hide, and the parts you have never shown anyone, laid out and seen clearly and accepted without response. She said it was the most terrifying thing she had ever experienced, and she had always been troubled by this, the most peaceful. I sat with that for a while. The coffee was strong and bitter, and the hot plate ticked as it cooled. I said, "The people in there, can they leave if they want to?" He said he believed so, technically. He said the door opened from the inside. He knew that because once, about 20 years ago, a guest who had been given the wrong key, a man who had gotten the red-tagged key by some error in the process, had come back to the office 20 minutes after checking in and returned the key and asked for a different room. The man was pale and very quiet, and he left the following morning at first light, and Darnell never saw him again. But he came back. He came back once, about a year later, and he stood in the parking lot near the front of the building for about 10 minutes without coming in, and then he left. Darnell had watched him from the office window. He said the man had the look of someone standing outside the house they grew up in, after it's been sold to someone else. The particular expression of someone who is deciding whether a thing that was once theirs is still theirs in any meaningful sense. I said, so people can walk out. He said some people do. He said more don't. He said he thought it had to do with how long you'd been in there. He said he believed, and this was his belief, not something he could prove, that the room worked on you gradually, that the longer you stayed, the more it took from you. And what it took was the particular friction of being yourself, the ongoing effort of maintaining your own boundaries and edges, the mental and emotional work of being a distinct person in a world that pushes back. He said he thought the room removed that friction entirely, made it so that you didn't have to be anyone in particular, didn't have to maintain anything, could simply breathe and exist without the weight of your own identity pressing on you. He said he thought that for some people, depending on the life they'd had and what they were carrying, the offer of that particular relief was one they chose to accept. Not passively, not as a victim of something external, as a choice. He said some of the people in that ledger were not people who would be described as missing. He said some of them were people who had very good reasons to want to stop being who they were. I thought about Marcus. I thought about Tommy Garrett's face going closed when I mentioned the Pineview. My buddy Marcus. I didn't say anything. He told me about the 6 a.m. thing. The way the key always returned to the board at 6 a.m. regardless of when the guest had gone in. He said he didn't understand the mechanism of it and had stopped trying to understand it decades ago. He said at some point each morning before dawn, he would hear the small sound of the key settling onto its hook, a sound he heard from anywhere in the building, a sound he heard through sleep, a sound he had heard every morning for 31 years, except for the 14 mornings when the night before had been a night when the room had taken someone. And on those mornings, the key's return was accompanied by a particular quality of silence that was different from the ordinary. A silence, he said, he could only describe as completed. He said he had learned to read that silence the way sailors learn to read the sky. He said when he heard it, he would get up and make coffee and sit in the back room and go through the ledger and add the name. And then he would make himself eat breakfast and open the office and run the property the same as any other day, because the alternative was not running the property, and he had decided a long time ago that he did not have that option. I asked him what he wanted from me. He looked at me across the small table, and I could see how tired he was, not just tonight tired, but the kind of structural tiredness that has been built into a person over decades, like a beam that has been bearing weight for so long that the compression has become part of its nature. He said, "I don't want anything from you." I said, "Then why tell me all this?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you kept coming back." He said, "In 31 years, you are the third person who kept coming back after the first time." He said, "The first one was a county assessor who started asking questions about the property taxes and eventually had a conversation with someone at the county office that resulted in an official inspection, which found nothing unusual because the inspection happened at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday when the room was quiet and no one had gone in for 6 weeks. He said the second one was a woman journalist who was working on a story about disappearances along rural state routes. He said she stopped coming back eventually. He said he didn't know why. He said he had sometimes wondered. He said the way he said things that were worse to think about, flatly, without inflection, letting the weight of them land without cushioning. Then he said, "You're the third." He said, "And you're different from the other two, because you're not here in any official capacity, and you don't have anything to prove. And every time you came back knowing more than the time before, and you still came back." He said, "I thought you might be the person I could tell." I said, "Tell? Why tell anyone?" He said, "Because someone should know." He said, "When I go, and I am not young and I am not well." He said this without self-pity, simply as information. "When I go, there will be no one here who understands what this place is." He said, "The property will pass to the county for back taxes, and someone will buy it and try to renovate it, and they will not know about the room, and people will go in and not come out, and there will be no ledger and no management, and no one who understands the shape of it." He said, "At least this way someone knows." He looked at me. He said, "At least this way the knowledge doesn't go into the room with me." And something in the way he said it, the phrasing of it, made me go still. I said, "Into the room with you." He looked back at me and said nothing. And I understood then what he had decided, or what he thought he was going to decide, or what he had perhaps already decided in some part of himself that was further along in the process than the part that still sat at small tables and drank coffee and talked to strangers. The lid on the jar. He had been the lid on the jar for 31 years, and he was tired in the way that a person gets tired when they have been holding something heavy for longer than the body was built to hold it, and he had found someone to give the knowledge to, and that was the thing he needed to do before he was done. I looked at him, and I thought about his father's breathing in the dark, the particular rhythm he had known his whole life and identified in the first hours of his father's absence, and then refused to listen for again in the 30 years since. And I thought about what it would mean to know that sound was in there, that specific sound, and to run the property for 3 more decades with that knowledge. And I understood the exhaustion differently then, not just as tiredness, as a kind of waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in room 9 until grey light came in under the curtains, and then I got up and I walked to the office and I put the key on the counter. Darnell Prout was behind the counter. He looked like he had slept, or at least rested, more rested than the night before. He handed me my receipt. I looked at the keyboard. The key for 13 was on its hook. Red tag. Level and still and present the way it always was. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at Darnell. I said, "Is there anything I can do?" He thought about it. He said no. He said it simply and without sadness. He said there's nothing to be done. He said there never was. I said I could tell someone. He said, "Tell who?" I said, "I don't know. Someone official." He said, "And say what?" I stood there and understood that he was right. I could say, "There is a motel on Route 9 with a room that takes people." I could say that, and they would send someone official, and the someone official would arrive at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. and the room would be quiet, and the key would be on its hook, and the concrete would be dry, and Darnell would be behind the counter doing his practiced welcome, and they would find nothing, and I would be the long-haul trucker with the too many miles and the overactive imagination. He said, "You can come back if you want." He said it carefully, not as an invitation exactly, more as an acknowledgement of what he had observed about me, that I was the kind of person who came back. I said, "I don't think I should." He said, "Probably not." He said, "But you will anyway." I drove out of the parking lot. I got on Route 9. I watched the orange sign shrink in my mirrors, and then it was gone around a bend, and there was just the road and the early morning light coming flat and cold over the fields on either side. I thought about 68 people breathing in the dark. I thought about the grandmother's description of being completely known. I thought about Darnell at 19, standing in the dark of the room with the pull all around him, and the room deciding something about him, and the thing in him that snapped back when it was deciding, and the 31 years that followed. I thought about his father's rhythm in the dark. I thought about Sandra Collier, 55 years old, white Nissan, Pennsylvania plates, going in at 2 in the morning while the man whose whole purpose was to prevent exactly that had for the first time in 30 years been asleep. He was right that I would come back. I have been back twice since October. Both times Darnell was there. Both times the key was on the hook. Both times the motel was exactly as it had always been. The gravel and the rust and the yellow light and the angled numbers. The second time I went back, I brought a notebook, a real one, not the margins of a dispatch log. I sat in room 9 and I wrote down everything Darnell had told me, everything I had observed, all the dates and details and the things he said about the room and what it did and what it was. I wrote for 3 hours. I have been writing, adding to it for 2 months. You are reading what came from that notebook. I want to be precise about why I'm telling you this, not because I want you to go there. Not because I think your curiosity or your bravery or your particular combination of skill and equipment will be the thing that finally makes sense of what's in room 13. I've seen what curiosity does at the Pineview, and I know the ledger well enough now to understand that curiosity is not a protection. I am telling you because Darnell Prout is not well, and the property will eventually pass, and the room will eventually become unmanaged, and the pool will become unchecked, and 68 people will keep breathing in the dark, with no one keeping the ledger, and no one giving out the right keys, and the number 68 will grow faster than it has in the years when there was someone deliberate standing between the room and the road. I am telling you because someone should know, because knowledge that goes into the room is knowledge that is gone, because Darnell said that to me and he was right, and I understood that the thing he was doing by telling me was the same thing I am doing by telling you. Keeping the knowledge on this side of the door, keeping it in the world where it can be weighed and held and passed along, keeping it away from the dark and the breathing and the patient, permanent, utterly indifferent quiet of whatever it is that waits in room 13 on Route 9, that has always waited, that will keep waiting, that does not need to hurry because it is not subject to the same losses as the rest of us, because it does not run out of time, because it does not get tired, because it does not sleep. I sleep badly. I wake at 2 in the morning in clean rooms with cooking shows on the television behind the counter, and I lie in the dark, and I listen, and sometimes in the listening I can almost pick out a sound that is not the heater or the traffic or the ice machine. A rhythm, slow and steady and deeply, terribly calm. I know it is not there. I know it is the particular cruelty of a mind that has been shown something it cannot file under any existing category, and so keeps returning to it the way a tongue returns to a broken tooth. I know this, but I also know that the knowing doesn't stop the listening. And I know that somewhere on Route 9, the orange sign is buzzing in the dark, and the gravel is crunching under the boots of someone who is too tired to keep driving, and the key with the red tag is hanging on its hook, and the door is warm to the touch, and the dark inside is full and patient and waiting to be completely, permanently, terrifyingly known. I went back in November. I told myself it was because of Darnell, because he had said he wasn't well, and I wanted to check on him, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth is harder to say cleanly. The whole truth is that the Pineview had become a fixed point in my life, the way certain things become fixed points, the way a scar becomes part of the map of your body. Not something you chose, but something that is now simply there, permanent and defining. I had 68 names in my notebook, and I had Darnell's voice in my head, saying the knowledge shouldn't go into the room with him. And I had the particular restlessness of a person who has been given a piece of something enormous and incomplete, and cannot put it down, because putting it down feels like abandonment. So I went back. It was a Thursday, mid-November, the kind of cold that has made up its mind, not the tentative cold of October that backs off in the afternoon and lets you think it might not be serious after all. This cold was settled and purposeful, and the sky above Route 9 was the flat white of a sky that has decided on winter and isn't interested in negotiation. I pulled into the Pineview lot at 9 in the evening, earlier than usual, and sat in the cab for a minute before going in. The lot had 3 cars I hadn't seen before, all of them near the front rooms, all of them ordinary-looking vehicles with that anonymous quality that cars acquire when they've been on the road long enough. Nothing in front of 13. The key would be on its hook. I already knew that. I had started to understand the key on the hook as a kind of vital sign, a thing you checked the way you check a pulse. Key on the hook meant the room was dormant, or whatever the right word was for the state the room was in when it wasn't actively doing what it did. Key on the hook meant Darnell was managing. Key on the hook meant the night was going to be ordinary, relatively speaking. He was behind the counter. He looked worse than October. Not dramatically worse, not the obvious deterioration of a sick person in a movie, but the gradual subtraction of someone who is losing ground slowly and steadily in a way that doesn't announce itself so much as accumulate. He was thinner. His color was off, a grayness that hadn't been there before, and his movements were slightly more deliberate, the deliberateness of someone who has started to have to think about things the body used to do automatically. He looked at me when I came in, and something happened in his face. Not quite relief, something adjacent to it. The expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific person and was not certain that person would arrive. He gave me room 9. He took the key from the hook before I could ask for it, the way you hand someone their usual order because they've been coming long enough that it's simply understood. I signed the register. I put my $38 on the counter. Then I said, "How are you doing?" He looked at me and said, "Not well, just that, not well." No elaboration, no invitation for sympathy, just the flat, accurate answer of a man who has spent a lifetime saying exactly as much as was required and no more. I said, "Is there anything you need?" He said, "I need someone to understand the ledger." I said, "I understand the ledger." He said, "You need to understand it better." He said, "Come back tonight, same time as before." I said, "Okay." I went to my room and I sat on the edge of the bed and I called Carol. I told her where I was. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I thought you were done with that place." I said I thought so too. She said, "What are you doing there?" I said I wasn't entirely sure, but that I thought it was important. She said, "Things being important is not the same thing as you needing to be the one handling them." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Come home after this one. Please." I said I would. I don't know if I believed it when I said it. I think she knew that. At midnight, I walked to the office. The light was off, which was his signal. I had come to understand that the light going off meant the property was settled and he was ready. I went around to the side door of the office building, a plain door that opened to a short hallway that connected to the back room. He had shown me that door in October. It was unlocked. I let myself in. He was at the table. The metal box was open in front of him, and the ledger was out, and next to it were several other items I hadn't seen before. A second notebook, thinner than the ledger, with a different cover. A folded map. 3 photographs, printed on plain paper the way you print something from an old digital file, slightly pixelated, the images soft. He had coffee made. He poured 2 cups and I sat down across from him, and he put 1 cup in front of me and he began. He told me about the room's geography. This sounds strange, but stay with me because it's important. The room had standard dimensions, the same 12 by 20 feet as every other room in the building. But Darnell had come to believe over decades of proximity that the space inside was not consistent with those dimensions. Not dramatically, not in a way that would register to someone who walked in under normal circumstances and looked around, but in small ways. He had measured the interior once, from the outside, calculating from the floor plan of the building, which he had, an original blueprint his grandmother had kept in a tube behind the ledger. Then he had measured from inside the door, standing in the doorway with a laser measure, measuring to the far wall. The discrepancy was 4 feet. The inside measured 4 feet longer than the outside should have allowed. He said this calmly, the way he said everything, and I sat with it and tried to find the rational explanation for it and couldn't. He said he had remeasured 3 times. He said the discrepancy was consistent. He said there was another thing about the room's geography, the photographs. He slid them across the table to me. I picked up the first one. It was taken from the doorway of the room, looking in. The flash had illuminated maybe 8 feet of interior before the dark swallowed everything. I could see a section of floor, a section of wall, the edge of what looked like a standard motel dresser, the kind made of pressed wood laminate that you see in every budget motel in the country. The floor looked ordinary. The wall looked ordinary. The dresser looked ordinary. I said, this looks like any motel room. He said, look at the corner. I looked at the corner where the floor met the wall on the left side of the image. I looked for a long time. Then I saw it. The corner wasn't right. Not dramatically wrong. Not visibly broken or shifted. But the angle was off in a way that was hard to quantify. The way an optical illusion is hard to quantify. The way you look at something and your brain keeps trying to correct it and keeps failing because the wrongness is built into the structure of the thing rather than being something overlaid on top of it. The corner of the room met at an angle that was not 90 degrees. It was close to 90 degrees, close enough that a quick look would miss it, but it wasn't 90. I said, how many corners are like this? He said all of them. He said he believed the room was not a rectangle. He said he believed, based on 31 years of measuring from outside and listening from inside and thinking about the 4-foot discrepancy and the corner angles, that the room's actual geometry was something he didn't have the mathematical vocabulary to describe precisely. He said he thought it was shaped the way certain things in nature are shaped, not in the clean geometric lines of human construction, but in the recursive, self-referential geometry of organic forms, the way a nautilus shell is shaped, or the way a wave is shaped, always folding back on itself, always the same pattern at every scale. He said he thought the room was larger on the inside than the outside, because the inside was, in some sense he couldn't fully articulate, folded. He said he thought this might be part of why the people inside didn't run out of space. He said there were 68 of them in there, by his count, plus however many had gone in before the ledger began, and they were all breathing, and the room had never become overcrowded, had never shown any sign of being at capacity. He said, it's a big room. He said it in the way of someone who has made a dark joke so many times over so many years that it has lost all its darkness and become simply a true statement. I picked up the second photograph. This one was taken from a different angle, further into the room, which meant someone had gone in far enough to turn around and photograph back toward the door. I looked at the doorway in the photograph. The door was a standard hollow-core motel door, painted dark green on the outside, and from the inside it looked as it should, slightly wider at the near edge due to the perspective of the shot. The light from outside the room came through the doorway, the orange-yellow light of the walkway, and it illuminated a rough rectangle of floor just inside the threshold. I studied that rectangle of floor. I studied the way the light fell on it. Then I looked more carefully at the edge where the light stopped and the dark of the room began. The edge was not crisp. It was soft. The light did not stop at a clear boundary the way light stops when it hits a wall or a corner. It faded gradually, the way light fades in a space that is deeper than the light can reach, deeper than it should have been able to be, given the 12 by 20 dimensions of the room. The room behind the lighted threshold looked very deep. I said, "Who took these?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I did." I said, "You went back in." He said, "No." He said he had put the camera on a tripod just inside the doorway and set the timer and stood in the walkway and let it take the shot and then retrieved it and closed the door. I said, "How far in did the tripod go?" He said, "About 18 inches, just inside the threshold." I looked at the photograph again. The depth behind those 18 inches was not consistent with a room that ended 20 feet from the door. The third photograph was the one that made me put the stack face down on the table and take a long, slow breath. It was taken from the same position as the second, looking back toward the door. But in this one, the door was partially visible in the corner of the frame, and you could see through the open door to the walkway outside, the concrete and the frost and the edge of the parking lot. And in the foreground of the shot, in the lit area just inside the threshold, the dark of the room coming up close behind, there was a hand on the floor resting palm up, not dramatically positioned, not reaching, not splayed in distress, just a hand resting. The way a hand rests when the body it belongs to is deeply, completely asleep. I looked at it for a long time. The hand looked real. I said, "There's a hand." He said, "Yes." I said, "Was that there when you set up the tripod?" He said, "No." I said, "So someone moved into the frame between when you set up the shot and when the timer went off?" He said, "I set it for a 2-second delay." I said, 2 seconds. He said, "Yes." I said, "That's not enough time for someone to move from the back of the room to the doorway." He said, "No." He said, "It isn't." I looked at the hand again. The light from the walkway fell on it clearly. It was an ordinary hand, neither large nor small, with short nails and a plain silver ring on the 4th finger. I said, "You know whose hand that is?" He said he thought he did. He said the ring was his father's. I sat with that for a while. The coffee cooled. The hot plate ticked. Outside, the wind had picked up and I could hear it moving along the eaves of the building, a long, cold sound, the sound of air with nowhere to go. I said, "When did you take these?" He said, 2003, 20 years ago. I said, "You've been sitting with this for 20 years. He said, "Yes." I said, "Why didn't you tell me about this in October?" He said, "Because in October I didn't know if I could trust you yet." He said it without apology, and I didn't expect one. Trust is a thing you build through return visits, and I had made enough of them now that he had made his decision. I said, "The hand. Your father's ring. What do you think that means?" He said he thought it meant his father was aware. Not trapped, not suffering in the way we'd use that word, but present in some sense. aware enough to move toward the door when the door was open, aware enough to reach. He said, I don't know if it was a warning or an invitation. He said it in the way of a man who has had 20 years to decide which it was and has not been able to. I said, have you tried to talk to him? Through the door. He said yes. He said he had stood at the door many times in the early years and said his father's name into the dark, quietly, so none of the guests in the adjacent rooms could hear. He said nothing had answered. He said the breathing continued at its own pace, unaltered, and nothing changed in the quality of the dark or the warmth of the air. He said he had eventually stopped. He said he stopped about 10 years after his father went in, on a night when he was particularly tired and particularly raw about it, and he had stood at the door and said his father's name, and then pressed his forehead against the wood of the door, and felt the warmth of it against his skin, and stayed there for a long time, long enough that the cold of the walkway had gotten into his joints, and then he had straightened up and gone back to the office and made his decision, W.H. It was the same decision he had been making every day for a decade, but which felt more final that particular night. The decision to stop waiting for something that had stopped being the thing he was waiting for. He unfolded the map. It was a photocopy of an old survey map, county records, the kind of map that shows property lines and topographical features in thin black lines on yellowed paper. He had marked it in pencil. The Pineview lot was circled. From the circle, at intervals along the road in both directions and at angles across the surrounding fields, he had made small marks, 12 of them, each one with a date and a number next to it. I said, what are these? He said other places. I looked at the distribution of the marks. They were not random. They formed a rough pattern, not a perfect circle, not a perfect line, but a shape that had an internal logic to it, the kind of shape you get when you're looking at the surface expression of something underground, the way a line of sinkholes tells you where a cavern runs beneath the surface. I said, places like the Pineview. He said, I think so. He said he had spent the better part of a decade collecting accounts and cross-referencing disappearances and talking to people the way I had talked to Tommy Garrett, obliquely, carefully, watching for the face that went closed. He said he had found 12 locations within a 200-mile radius that fit the pattern. Not motels, not all of them. A farmhouse that had been in a family for 4 generations before the family stopped living in it and started renting it out, and the tenants kept leaving without collecting their security deposits. A storage facility where the overnight attendant had quit 6 times in 3 years. A section of a state park trail that had been closed for maintenance since 2009 and never reopened, with a sign that was periodically replaced with a new sign that still said maintenance. A church basement in a small town 2 counties over, a church that was still active and whose congregation worshipped above the basement every Sunday without ever going down the stairs. He had written to some of these places. He had called some of them. He had driven to 2. He said the church basement was the one that confirmed something for him. He said the pastor of the church, an elderly man who had been there for 40 years, had answered his questions over the phone with the same managed distance, the same practiced calibration of how much normal to display that Darnell himself used every day. He said he had recognized it immediately, the particular grammar of someone who has organized their life around an accommodation. He said the pastor had eventually said, "I think you know about your own situation." And Darnell had said yes. And the pastor had said, "Then you understand." And Darnell had said yes. And they had stayed on the phone in silence for a moment and then hung up without any further exchange. He said that had been the loneliest phone call of his life. He told me he believed the pattern on the map was not coincidental. He said he believed these locations were connected in some way he couldn't describe precisely, that they were the surface expressions of something that ran deeper, something that had existed before any of the structures built above it, and that used those structures the way a vine uses a trellis, not caring what shape the trellis was, only needing something to attach to. He said he didn't know what the something was. He said he had read everything he could find that seemed relevant: old land survey records, geological histories of the region, ethnographic accounts of indigenous traditions around certain areas of land, historical accounts of unexplained disappearances along this section of the eastern seaboard, going back to the colonial period. He said the records were fragmentary and inconsistent, but that a pattern emerged if you didn't look directly at any individual account, and instead let your eyes go soft and looked at the shape of the whole. He said the pattern was, certain places take people. They always have. They take the ones who stop moving long enough to be taken, the ones who are tired enough or lost enough or willing enough that the thing underneath can do what it does. He said he thought the motels and the farmhouses and the church basements were all just the current version of what those places had always been. Way stations, thresholds, places where the world was thin enough that stopping there was a different kind of stopping. I said, "Do you think they're suffering in there?" He was quiet for a long time. The wind moved along the eaves. He said, "I think suffering requires the ongoing experience of being a self that is in distress." He said he thought the people in the room had, over time, stopped being selves in the way we meant by that word. He said it slowly, carefully, like a man navigating ground he'd covered many times but still found uncertain. He said, "I think there is something in there that used to be each of them. I think it still has their shape, the way water takes the shape of its container. But I don't think it still has their weight." He said, "I think the weight is what hurts." He said, "I think the room takes the weight." He said it and then looked at his hands on the table, at the coffee cup between them, and I understood that he was talking not just about the people in the room. I said, "You're thinking about going in?" He didn't answer immediately. He said, "I'm 63 years old and I have a thing in my pancreas that the doctor in Pemberton calls aggressive, and I have been running this property alone for 31 years, and I am very, very tired." He said, "I am not romanticizing it." He said, "I know what the room does and I know what it takes, and I am not confused about what would happen if I went in. He said, I'm just telling you what I know. I said, you're the lid on the jar. He looked at me. He said, yes. And then he said, and lids wear out. I said, not yet. He said, no, not yet. He looked at me across the small table, and something passed between us that I don't have clean language for, a kind of understanding, a kind of mutual acknowledgement of what the situation was and what it required. He said, that's why I need you to understand the ledger better. He spent the next 2 hours going through it with me. Not the entries themselves, I knew those, but the context around them, the patterns. He had a theory about the rate, why some years had no entries and some years had 2 or 3. He believed it was connected to the weather, or more specifically to the pressure, barometric pressure, the kind of thing that affects how you feel in a way that's hard to attribute to a specific cause, the vague heaviness of certain days, the particular weight of the air before a major weather system. He said on high-pressure days, the pull was quieter. He said on low-pressure days, especially the sustained low pressure of a long winter storm system moving through, the pull was stronger, and on those nights he was most careful with the keys. He had correlated his records against historical weather data going back to 1980, and the correlation was not perfect, but it was significant. He said he had managed the last 8 years almost entirely without an incident, because he had gotten good enough at reading the conditions that he knew the high-risk nights well in advance. And on those nights, he put a closed sign in the window of the office and turned off the vacancy light and sat in the back room with the ledger until the pressure changed. He said the Sandra Collier night had been a low-pressure night. He said he had known it was a risk night, but he had been running a low-grade fever for 2 weeks, and the tiredness had gotten into him in a new way, and he had fallen asleep before 10, and he had not heard her pull in, and he had not heard her walk to the office, and he did not know how she had gotten in or how she had gotten the key, because the office had been locked. He said when he woke up at 3 in the morning, something felt different, and he had gone out to the walkway and her car was in front of 13, and the key was in the door, and the door was closed, and there was nothing he could do because you could not go in after someone. You could not drag someone out once the process had started, or if you could, he had no idea how, and going in himself would mean 2 people in the room instead of 1, and no one managing the property. He said he had stood in front of that door for 2 hours. He said, I stood there until 6 in the morning when I heard the key come back to the hook. He said, and then I went in and made coffee and wrote her name in the ledger. He said it in the same flat tone he used for everything, but I could see in his hands, which were very still on the table in the way of hands being deliberately kept still, what those 2 hours had cost him. Before I left that night, he gave me 2 things. The first was a copy of the survey map with his pencil markings, a photocopy he had made on the small printer in the back room. He folded it and gave it to me and said, if something happens to me and someone comes asking, this is the context. The second thing he gave me was a key, not a motel key, a different kind of key. A small flat key, the kind that opens a padlock on a plain metal ring. He said the ledger is in the box and the box takes this key. He said if I'm not here when you come back and the box is in the office, this is how you open it. I said, why would you not be here? He looked at me and said nothing. I took the key. I put it in my pocket. I said, I'll come back in December. He said, all right. He said it with the same managed distance, but underneath it something had shifted. The distance was a little shorter, the management a little lighter. I thought about what he had said. Not yet. Lids wear out. Not yet. I drove to Harrisburg. I made my delivery. I called Carol and I told her about the conversation, and she listened the whole way through without interrupting, same as the first time I told her about the Pineview over a year ago now. When I finished, she said, "This man is going to go into that room." I said, "I think he's thinking about it." She said, "And you want to stop him?" I said, "I want to make sure someone is there to manage the property if he does." She was very quiet. Then she said, "You want to be the lid on the jar." I said I didn't know about want exactly. She said, "You understand what you're describing?" I said yes. She said, "You understand what it means to stay near that place, to keep going back, to let it become your responsibility?" I said yes. She said, "I don't think you do." And she said it gently, not critically, the way you say something to a person you love when you can see something they can't see about themselves. She said, "I think you went there the first time because you were curious, and you went back because you were stubborn, and you went back again because you had started to care about him, about Darnell, about this man who has been alone with this thing for 30 years, and now you are trying to figure out how to inherit what he has." She said, "That's not a criticism." She said, "I know who you are. I know that's who you are. But I need you to understand that I know what you're considering before you've said it out loud." I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, "I'm not going to do anything I haven't thought through completely." She said, "I know." She said, "But I need you to think through me." I said, "I know." She said, "Come home first. Come home and sleep in your own bed and eat a real meal and look at me and tell me about it face to face, and then we'll decide together." I said, "Okay." She said, "Promise me." I said, "I promise." I went home. I sat at my own kitchen table in my own house with the dog on my feet, and the television going in the other room, and Carol across from me with her hands around a mug of tea. And I told her everything, all of it, from the first night with the key on the hook to the hand in the photograph to the pastor on the phone who had said, "I think you understand about your own situation." She listened. She asked questions, good ones, the questions of a nurse who is trained to gather information without flinching. She asked about Darnell's health, what he had said about the pancreas thing, whether he was getting treatment. I said I didn't know. She said, "Ask him." She said, "Find out what treatment he's getting and for how long and what the prognosis is, so you know what kind of timeline you're actually working with." She said, "You are not going to make any decisions based on incomplete information if I have anything to say about it." She said it firmly, and I was grateful for it in a way I still feel when I think about that night. The particular gratitude of someone who has been carrying something heavy alone and has finally, carefully, set it down in front of someone else and had the someone else not drop it. She asked if I thought the property could be managed remotely, or with someone else helping, or if it required the constant physical presence Darnell maintained. I said I thought the physical presence was part of it, because the pull was a real thing that operated in real time and required someone on site who understood the conditions well enough to respond to them. She said, so you'd have to be there, not all the time. She said, what does Darnell do when he has to leave for supplies or a doctor's appointment? I said I assumed he closed the office and turned off the vacancy sign the way he did on high-risk nights. She said, and nothing happens during those windows. I said, not that I know of. She said, so there's flexibility. She said it in the tone of someone who is doing structural engineering in their head, testing load-bearing assumptions, figuring out what can hold weight and what can't. She said, what's the minimum presence required? I said I didn't know, but I could find out. She said, find out. She said, and find out about the other people, the map, whether any of them are managing their situations in a way that involves more than one person. She said, you are not going to do this alone, if there's any way to avoid it. I sat across from my wife at my kitchen table in the house we had lived in for 20 years, and I looked at her face, which I knew the way you know a landscape you've spent a long time in, and I thought about 68 people breathing in the dark, and 12 other places on Darnell's map with their own ledgers, and their own managed distances, and their own exhausted custodians. And I thought about Sandra Collier, who had pulled in on a low-pressure night, while the man who SH would have been awake was asleep with a fever. And I thought about what it meant to be the lid on the jar, and whether it was the kind of thing a person could do in shifts, in partnership, with someone else checking the weather data, and someone else watching the vacancy sign, and someone else making the coffee in the back room after the key returned to the hook. I thought about all of this, and I said to Carol, I need to go back in December and ask Darnell a lot of questions. She said, yes, you do. She said, and I might come with you. I looked at her. She looked back at me with the steadiness that 23 years of nursing builds in a person, the steadiness of someone who has sat in rooms with things that cannot be fixed and found a way to be present anyway. She said, don't look at me like that. She said, I am not going anywhere near that room, but I want to see the man who's been holding this alone for 31 years. I want to see his face. She said, and I want him to know he's not alone anymore, even if we don't know yet what that means in practical terms. She said, people shouldn't have to be alone with things like this. She was right. She has always been right about the things that matter. I think about what she said a lot. People shouldn't have to be alone with things like this. I think about the grandmother who built the room around the thing she couldn't move and managed it alone until she couldn't. I think about the father who went in on a night in 1989 and whose ring appeared at the edge of the light in a photograph taken 14 years later, his hand resting palm up on the floor just inside the door, reaching or warning or simply present, in whatever way presence still meant something in the context of what the room had made him. I think about Darnell at 19, standing in the dark with the room deciding something about him, and the thing in him that snapped back, and the 31 years of managing the property alone that followed, and the thing in his pancreas that was using the word aggressive, and the ledger with its 68 names, and the entry that said I was asleep for the first time in 30 years. I think about all of them, and I think about what Carol said. People shouldn't have to be alone with things like this. And I think, for the first time since I pulled off Route 9 on a Tuesday night in late October a year ago, and heard the gravel crunch under my boots, I think that maybe the most important thing is not understanding what the room is, not mapping its geometry, or analyzing its pull, or adding names to the ledger, with the practiced neutrality of someone who has accommodated the terrible into the structure of ordinary life. Maybe the most important thing is simpler and harder than any of that. Maybe the most important thing is just to show up, to keep the key on the hook and the vacancy sign pointed at the road and the ledger accurate and the door warm against your palm in the cold and the office light burning yellow into the dark, and to not be alone while you do it. To be the lid on the jar together, 2 people instead of 1. And then to find the people at the other 11 marks on the map and tell them the same thing. You are not alone with this. We know about your situation. We understand the managed distance, and we are not going anywhere. I am going back in December. Carol is coming with me. I don't know what we'll find. I don't know if Darnell will be there, whether the light will be on in the office, or whether I'll need the small flat key in my pocket to open the metal box and sit down in the back room and read the ledger by myself and understand that the property has passed to me in the way that such things pass, not through legal documents or formal agreements, but through the simple fact of being the person who showed up enough times that the knowledge transferred. I don't know if Carol will walk the walkway and feel what the woman at the vending machine felt, the place holding its breath, or if she'll put her hand against the door of 13 and feel the warmth the way I felt it, that steady body temperature warmth that means something is alive in the dark that should not be alive in the dark, that has been alive in the dark for longer than any reasonable accounting of life allows. I don't know any of it, but I know I am going. I know the gravel will crunch, and the orange sign will buzz, and the brass numbers on the doors will hang at angles, because they've lost their screws, except for 13, which has always had both, and has always hung level, straight and true, the one straight thing in a crooked place. And I know the key will be on the hook, or I'll find out what it means when it isn't. Either way, I'll be there. Either way, I will not look away. Either way, the breathing in the dark of room 13 will continue, slow and patient and permanent, full of people who stopped being people in the way we mean by that word, full of my buddy Marcus and Sandra Collier and Dale Richter and 65 others, and the man whose ring appeared at the edge of the light, with his hand resting palm up on the floor, reaching or warning or simply being as present as the room allowed him to be, which was more present than nothing and less. Present than gone, which was its own kind of staying. its own kind of refusal to disappear completely, even into the dark, even after all those years, even after the weight had been taken and the friction had been smoothed away, and all that remained was the slow rhythm of breathing in a room that was larger on the inside than the outside should have allowed. Even then, still there, still reaching, the hand in the light at the edge of everything, fingers open, patient as the dark itself, waiting in the only way it still knew how. I'm not afraid of what I'll find in December. I have been afraid of it, and I have moved through the fear the way you move through weather, not because you are brave, but because the road goes through it, and you are on the road, and stopping is not the kind of option that actually resolves anything. The Pineview is on my road now. It has been for a year, and I understand that it will be for whatever years I have left on this route through this particular part of the world, where the fabric is thin and something reaches through. I am going in December, and I am taking my wife, and I am going to look Darnell Prout in the face and tell him what she told me. You are not alone with this anymore. And I am going to sit in the back room with the coffee and the metal box and the map with its 12 marks, and I am going to start making plans. The way you make plans when the route ahead is long and the conditions are uncertain, but you know the destination and you have a full tank and someone beside you who is not afraid of the dark. That is what I am going to do. That is what the situation requires. And when I pull out of the lot in the morning and get on Route 9 and the orange sign shrinks in my mirrors, I will not be leaving the Pineview behind. I know that now. I have known it for a while. You do not leave the Pineview. You carry it. You carry it the way you carry any knowledge that has changed the shape of the world you live in, permanently, without remedy, integrated into everything you see from that point forward. The key with the red tag. The warmth against your palm. The breathing in the dark, patient as geology, deep as whatever it is that lies beneath the thin places in the world and waits for the tired and the lost and the willing to stop moving long enough to be reached. I carry all of it. I will keep carrying it. And on a cold December morning, I will pull into the gravel lot of the Pineview Motor Lodge on Route 9, and I will hear the crunch under my boots, and the orange light will be buzzing, and I will push open the glass door with the bell above it, and I will see what I see. And whatever I see, I will not look away.